Curtis Navell stared at the screen, the glow of the monitor reflecting off his tired face. The lines of code flickered in front of him, all interwoven in a complex web of symbols and commands, but his mind was elsewhere. His body, as usual, felt stiff and exhausted, a reminder of how long he'd been sitting in front of this screen, buried in his work. His fingers hovered over the keys as if the solution he sought might reveal itself in the next line of code. He leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles, then his neck, and finally letting out a sigh. 39 years old, single, and for all intents and purposes, invisible in a world that moved at the speed of light. His hairline had started to recede a few years ago, and the weight he carried was less about his physical body and more about the emotional burden he wore around his chest. The years were beginning to stack up in ways he couldn't ignore. He looked at his reflection in the darkened screen, a weary man with a few too many late nights and a few too many regrets. He was a coder for one of the top virtual reality companies, Rebirth, where his job was essentially to create worlds. Yet, here he was, designing fantastical environments for other people to live out their dreams while his own dreams seemed to fade with every passing day. For years, Curtis had worked on VR systems that allowed users to escape the constraints of their real lives. He had designed worlds where the sick could walk again, the old could feel young, and the weak could feel powerful. But when it came to his own life, he felt stuck. No matter how much he tried to escape into the digital universe, it never quite filled the empty void that lingered when the virtual headset was removed. His body betrayed him, but there had to be a way around it, and that's when it happened. Curtis had spent years delving into the intricacies of virtual bodies. He had built avatars for other people, ones that were sleek and youthful, digital representations of the best versions of themselves. But what if, just what if, he could use the same technology to create a new body for himself? He wasn't talking about simple cosmetic tweaks, like perfect skin or a taller frame. No, Curtis had bigger ideas. What if he could truly transcend the limitations of his physical form? What if he could design a body that was better than the one that had been slowly decaying in the real world? The thought had been gnawing at the back of his mind for weeks, and tonight, it was impossible to ignore. He began typing furiously, a new project taking shape as he input a string of commands that he knew could, if executed correctly, open the door to something remarkable. The idea wasn't new. He had read about experiments in the virtual world where consciousness could be transferred from one form to another, virtual to virtual, of course. But what if the process could be flipped? What if a person could transfer their consciousness from a virtual body into a real-world body, one designed using the very technology he had spent his career perfecting? Curtis chuckled at himself, the absurdity of it making him smile. This wasn't just about creating a new avatar. This was about becoming someone, or something, else. This was about rewriting his existence. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of excitement in his chest, the pulse of possibility. Maybe he could fix it all. Maybe this would be the answer he had been waiting for. His fingers flew over the keyboard, crafting the code that would, if everything went according to plan, recreate him. He was working on a prototype system, a software that allowed for virtual creations to be made in the real world. His mind raced as he envisioned the new body, tall, athletic, confident, unburdened by age or fatigue. The flaws of his old body could be erased, and he would finally have the freedom to live life on his terms. Curtis didn't pause to think through the potential consequences of his actions. He was too tired of thinking about the rules. Too tired of being trapped in the body that had been given to him. The program was almost finished. He clicked the final command, and the screen went black. The next few seconds felt like an eternity, and then, it happened. Curtis felt an odd, almost dizzying sensation in his mind. It was as if he were being pulled in multiple directions at once, a tugging feeling at the base of his skull. A heartbeat passed, then another. And suddenly, his vision flickered. The world around him blurred. He blinked, but something was wrong. He could still see the cluttered room around him, his chair, his desk, his laptop, but everything felt off. He could feel his hands, but they didn't feel like his hands. They were warmer, smoother, and when he looked down at them, he saw that the skin was now tight, almost glowing with an unnatural sheen. The fingertips were longer, too. The nails were perfect. Panic swirled inside him, but then he remembered, the body. He had done it. He had created a new body for himself. But something was wrong. He scrambled to get up, but his legs felt unsteady, too long, too lanky. His vision flickered again, and he stumbled over to the mirror on the wall. What he saw in the reflection made him stagger back in disbelief. It was him, but it wasn't. The body before him was a combination of perfection and bizarre. His jawline was sharp, almost unrealistically so. His chest was muscular, too sculpted. But his arms were ridiculous. They were far too long, almost grotesque, hanging limply at his sides like a stretched-out mannequin. His skin, while smooth, had an unnatural quality to it. It shimmered faintly under the dim light, and his face, though youthful, had an almost digital quality to it. His eyes were too wide, and the color of his pupils was off, an unnerving blend of blue and green. What the hell? Curtis mumbled to himself, stepping closer to the mirror to examine his new form. His voice sounded distant, hollow. A synthetic echo, like a voice distorted through a bad microphone. His mind raced. He had expected to feel younger, healthier. But this? This was something else entirely. He took a step forward. His body moved more fluidly than he had ever remembered. His balance was perfect, as if every muscle had been recalibrated. But with every step, there was a strange, disorienting feeling. The body was alive, yes, but it wasn't quite right. It wasn't fully human. Curtis flexed his fingers and felt a strange sensation, as though his hands were more responsive than they should have been. He reached up to touch his face, his skin cold to the touch, and shuddered. His mind tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he was feeling, but it was impossible. This was his body, yes, but it was also a mockery of what a human body should be. And in that moment, the horrifying thought crossed his mind: could this body even be considered human anymore? Curtis couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. His reflection was strange, alien, and yet undeniably his. There was no denying that he had succeeded in his experiment. He had created a new body for himself, one far beyond the constraints of his original form. But the euphoria of success quickly turned sour as he began to take in the full scope of what he'd done. His reflection moved in perfect synchrony with his thoughts, but it felt distant, as if the body had a life of its own. He reached for the countertop to steady himself, his long fingers wrapping around the edge with an unsettling precision. His thoughts raced. He was in this new form, but this form wasn't entirely him. The smoothness of his skin felt unreal, as if it were something constructed, something synthetic. His muscles flexed effortlessly, but they weren't the muscles of someone who had worked out for years. They were the muscles of someone built in a lab, someone designed for aesthetic perfection, not the slow, grinding toil of sweat and pain that came with natural growth. He took another step. His legs were too long, too strong, his stride an exaggerated motion. He moved like someone accustomed to a body that could bend and flex with far more agility than any human body was meant to. He had the grace of a dancer, but it was jarring, a performance that felt foreign, forced. As he walked, he caught sight of his reflection again. His head looked too small for his body, like it had been placed atop an oversized mannequin. His breathing hitched as the thought sank in: this wasn't just a body. This wasn't just a new skin he could step into and forget about. This was a construction, a virtual approximation of the ideal, but without any of the organic flaws that made a person real. He wasn't human anymore. And for the first time, he felt the bitter weight of that truth. The urge to test his new body overwhelmed him. Without thinking, he turned toward the open window. It was high up in his apartment building, the city sprawling below him. Without hesitating, he leapt, across the room. His feet landed with a soft thud, but it was nothing like the jarring, aching landing of his old body. His knees didn't buckle, his back didn't ache. He stood tall, his heart pounding with exhilaration. The height of the jump, he had never been able to do something like that before. He laughed, but the sound that escaped his lips was hollow, distorted, almost as if the body was rejecting the sound. He shook his head, pushing the unsettling feeling away. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "This is just new. It'll take some getting used to." But as he stood there, the reality of the situation began to creep in. This new body was a product of his mind, a mind that, in some ways, didn't feel entirely his own anymore. His thoughts, once so familiar, now seemed to stretch and warp in strange, unnatural ways. His emotions flickered in erratic bursts. One moment, he was excited, bubbling with joy and curiosity about his newfound abilities. The next, he was 1,000 miles away, thinking of something that had no place in this moment. He turned back into his apartment. The unfamiliar ease with which he moved, almost too easy, reminded him that he had no choice but to confront this head-on. The world had changed. He had changed. The soft hum of his computer screen brought his attention back to reality. He was still connected to the system, still in the digital realm that had created him. Curtis had never considered what would happen to him once he had transferred his consciousness. He assumed, like most users of VR tech, that his mind would remain intact, untouched. But this felt different. His mind was out of sync with his body, or perhaps it was his body that was out of sync with him. He could feel the edges of the algorithm, the code he had so meticulously crafted, wobble under the weight of his new form. The reality of what he had done was too vast to ignore now. He had gone too far. This was no longer about simply upgrading his body or making himself feel better. This was about changing the very essence of what it meant to be human. A noise broke his train of thought. It was the doorbell. He hesitated, his hand twitching in the air before instinctively reaching for the door. His fingers were too quick, too coordinated, and when he opened it, his movements felt almost robotic. "Whoa," said Brad, his old friend from the office. Brad stood in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the strange new figure standing before him. Brad had known Curtis for years, had seen him at his best and his worst. But this was something else. Curtis tried to smile, but the expression felt awkward on his face, as if his muscles weren't used to the motion. "Hey," he said, his voice too bright, too crisp, as if his vocal cords were struggling to keep up with the new, altered form. Brad blinked, then took a cautious step forward. "What the hell happened to you, man?" His voice was laced with confusion, awe, and a hint of disbelief. Curtis leaned against the doorframe, unsure of what to say. I made a change." He smiled again, but it felt off. He was struggling to keep his excitement in check, to mask the unease that was growing inside him. Brad didn't respond at first. Instead, he reached out, his hand shaking as he touched Curtis's shoulder, almost as if confirming that he wasn't dreaming. You're not real," Brad said, his voice barely a whisper. "What did you do to yourself?" Curtis's mind raced. He knew this moment was coming. He had always known that people would react to him differently. But he hadn't anticipated it would feel like this, like he was no longer the person they had known. "It's real," Curtis said, though it sounded hollow. It's me." Brad shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right words. You can't just do this. People can't just change like this, Curtis." The words stung. They cut deeper than Curtis had expected. "Why not?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge he hadn't intended. "What's wrong with changing? People do it all the time. We change the world, we change our lives. Why not our bodies?" Brad took a step back, raising his hands. "This isn't what I meant, man. This is different. You're different." Curtis felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. His reflection from earlier, the one that seemed so unreal, suddenly felt all too real. He was different. But what did that really mean? Was he still a person? Or had he crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Brad left soon after, muttering about calling someone, about getting help, but Curtis barely registered the words. He was already lost in his thoughts again, staring at the door that had just closed behind his friend. Minutes later, the knock came again. But this time, it wasn't Brad. It was someone else. A group of reporters, a pair of bioethicists, and an ex-girlfriend who had heard about his revolutionary transformation from a viral social media post. The world was already talking about Curtis. What he had done was no longer just a personal experiment. It was a cultural phenomenon, an ethical quandary, and a living, breathing example of where technology might take humanity. Each new visitor only reinforced what Curtis had begun to realize: his new body wasn't just an upgrade. It was a product of something much darker, a symbol of the potential dangers of pushing technology beyond its ethical boundaries. And as the debates over his new form escalated, Curtis couldn't help but feel the same way he had felt before, only more so. He wasn't sure if the world had changed, or if it was him who had gone too far. The doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent, dragging Curtis back from the spiral of his thoughts. He didn't need to answer it. He knew exactly who it was before he even walked toward the door. The reporters had arrived in a swarm. He could hear the muffled voices outside, talking over one another, arguing about who would get the first word. It was only a matter of time before they found their way to him. Curtis stood still for a moment, staring at his own reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked perfect. Too perfect. And that was the problem. There was nothing real about it. His jawline was sharper, his skin smoother, but none of it felt earned. It felt like a mask, one that he had built himself out of desperation and technology. There was nothing human about it, not in the way people were supposed to be human. He opened the door slowly, not in the mood to fight, not in the mood to pretend like he had everything figured out. A group of reporters shoved their microphones into his face before he could even speak. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, blinding him momentarily. He blinked, trying to adjust. "Mr. Navell, is it true that you've replaced your original body with a virtual one?" One of the reporters shouted over the crowd, her voice almost shrill. She shoved a microphone under his nose, forcing him to answer. Curtis didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a slow breath, trying to regain his composure, but the weight of the moment was already pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. He had turned into a spectacle. People were fascinated. They were terrified. They wanted answers. It's more complicated than that," Curtis finally said, his voice coming out colder than he intended. "I didn't just replace my body. Before he could finish, another reporter interrupted. "Do you think it's ethical to alter the human body in this way? What kind of message are you sending to the public about our biological limits?" The barrage of questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last, like daggers aimed straight at his chest. The ethics of what he had done were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. He hadn't expected this. He had hoped, no, he had assumed that once he achieved his goal, the world would celebrate it. That the boundaries of humanity could be pushed, that the impossible could be made real. But now, the world wasn't ready for what he had done. They didn't see the potential, they only saw the violation. "I just wanted to live better," Curtis muttered, half to himself, his hand running through his hair in agitation, though it felt too smooth under his touch, too artificial. The reporters pressed on, their voices becoming a cacophony of judgment and fear. One by one, their faces blurred together, as if the reality of it all was too much for him to take in. Their questions were accusations, their eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and moral outrage. "How does this affect your mind?" another reporter asked. "You're talking about manipulating the very essence of what makes us human. Don't you think that's dangerous?" He swallowed hard. It was true. His mind, his thoughts, didn't feel like they had full control anymore. They flickered in and out, like a dying signal trying to hold on to something it couldn't quite grasp. "I didn't know what would happen," he admitted. The truth sounded strange in his own ears. He was no longer in control. The body wasn't just new, it was alien, and the more he used it, the more it felt like it was using him. But I can feel everything. I can think clearer. Do things I couldn't do before. Do you feel human? The question came from the back of the crowd. It was softer than the others, almost too quiet to hear, but Curtis caught it, and it hung in the air like a weight that he hesitated. There was a part of him that wanted to scream, to shout that he was more than human now, that he had transcended the physical limitations of the body. But then there was another part of him, a part buried deep under the pride and the excitement, that knew the truth. He wasn't more than human. He had stripped away the parts of himself that made him human in the first place. He had tried to fix what was never meant to be fixed. I don't know, he said quietly, finally giving in to the truth that had been gnawing at him from the inside. I don't think I do. The reporters fell silent for a moment. For the first time, Curtis felt like the questions were catching up to him, too fast, too overwhelming. He had thought he was in control of the situation, that he could manipulate his own story. But now, standing in front of the crowd, with all eyes trained on him, he realized he had been manipulating himself all along. He had built this body as if it could fix everything that was wrong with him. But it hadn't fixed anything. That it had only made him more aware of his own emptiness. The crowd seemed to grow quiet, sensing his discomfort. The reporters shuffled back a bit, giving him space. But it was too late for that. The damage was already done. Curtis had become the story now. His body, his choice, was no longer a personal decision, it was a spectacle for public consumption. And as the media swarmed around him, Curtis knew this was only the beginning. The world wasn't just curious about him, they were terrified. That he turned his back on the reporters without another word, the sound of their voices fading as he retreated into the apartment. He wanted to be alone. He needed to think. The apartment felt suffocating now. The air felt thick, and every breath seemed more difficult than the last. He had always been a solitary person, sure, but this was different. His mind wasn't his anymore, and the body, this new, perfect, unreal body, wasn't a comfort. It was a constant reminder that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. His fingers twitched, and for a moment, the sensation was almost unbearable. It was as though his body wasn't responding to him at all, but to something else, some other force or algorithm that had been coded into him. The muscles in his arms flexed involuntarily, his skin shimmered in the dim light, and for a split second, he saw a flash of blue, electric light pass over his reflection. He closed his eyes, clutching at his head, feeling the flicker of disconnect between his mind and this body. What was happening to him? Was this just a glitch? Or was this the true cost of what he had done? The ringing of his phone cut through the silence. Curtis didn't want to answer it. He didn't want to speak to anyone. But the name on the screen caught his eye, Dr. Rachel Alvarez. She was one of the few people who had known about his project, someone who had worked in the virtual sciences with him years ago. She had always been the voice of caution, urging him not to go down this path, warning him of the dangers. She had never liked his obsession with immortality, with perfection. He answered the call reluctantly. Curtis, she said, her voice calm, measured. Are you okay? I saw the footage. I need you to understand what you've done. I know what I've done, Curtis replied, his voice hoarse. I've changed. I don't feel anything anymore, Rachel. This wasn't supposed to happen. Don't you see? You've done more than change. You've become something else entirely. Your mind is not made for this. Your body is not made for this. And what's worse is that you've made it real. The world is going to see you as the new frontier of humanity, and you're not ready for what that means. Curtis squeezed his eyes shut. I thought I was. I thought I could handle it. You can't. None of us can. You can't play God, Curtis. There are consequences. You're already seeing them, aren't you? The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Help me, Rachel," Curtis whispered. "Tell me how to fix it." But Rachel's voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "I don't think there's a way to fix it. What's done is done." Curtis dropped the phone to his side, his hands trembling. The world outside his apartment felt like it was closing in on him. He had opened a door that couldn't be closed again, and as the days passed, he realized the truth. The consequences of what he had done weren't just about his body or mind. They were about the world's perception of him, and what it meant for everyone else who might try to follow in his footsteps. What had begun as a personal experiment had turned into something far bigger, and much darker, than he had ever imagined, and now, Curtis was no longer sure where he ended, and where the world began.